السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على محمد سيد المرسلين وعلى آله أجمعين أما بعد. Okay, hello and welcome everyone to the last session of last episode of this season of Back to Basics and Ethis Educational Series on Islamic Finance. So Alhamdulillah, over the last 4 weeks almost, we have been going through the very basics of Islamic finance, including the basics of Islamic law of contract. Then we have gone through the basic sales contract. Then last week we did a bit of discussion on Musharraka and Mudaraba, which are the partnership contracts of Islamic finance. And today we will end, inshallah, with Ijara contract. So initially the thought was that we will be having some supportive contract for today. But then after further deliberation, what we wanted is actually to give a glimpse of Islamic finance basics. And if we look at the most used contracts after the sales and partnership contracts, it's basically Ijara. So we thought, okay, let's do that. Let's go through the basics of Ijara. And inshallah, in the next seasons, we will go to the other contracts, the supportive contracts, for example, Waqala, Qaz, Hawala, and Rahan, for example, and other contracts that are used in Islamic finance. Okay, so we can begin, inshallah. If you recall this chart in the very beginning, we have been using that. And as you see in this chart, the very first day, we covered sales, the law of contract, etc. And in the second episode, we did Murabaha, which also covers a lot about other sales contracts as well. In the third one, we did Mudaraba Musharraka, and today, inshallah, we'll be doing Ijara. Now, what is Ijara? Basically, Ijara in Arabic is also a bay', a sale, but it's not a sale of asset. It's not bay'ul a'yan, rather it's a bay'ul manafi'. It's a sale of usufruct. It's a sale of utility, sale of benefit. So instead of selling the asset itself, I'm selling the utility of the asset. So for example, in a sale contract, I would sell the car itself. So the person who is purchasing from the sale contract would own the car itself. However, in an Ijara contract, when I lease a car, I don't sell the car itself, rather I sell the benefit, the utility, the usufruct of the car. Meaning that the person who is purchasing the utility is basically purchasing the utility or the benefit of using the car, maybe for a time bound, for example, 1 hour, 2 hours, 8 hours, 1 day, 2 day, 1 month, 1 year, or maybe by distance, right? So for example, in Malaysia, we have Grab. In other countries, there is Uber. So with those applications, what we do, we rent the car for certain distance. In some cases, for certain, the bill is based on the time, and in some cases based on a combination of both time and distance. So these are all examples of an Ijara contract. So the asset itself is not sold. The ownership of the asset is not sold. Rather, the utility or the usufruct of the asset is sold. Now, how would be the usufruct specified? It can be varying based on the customary practices of that asset itself. There is no specific requirement by Sharia, but the Sharia would require, of course, to specify the usufruct. Just like we mentioned in the sale contract that it has to be specified what is going to be sold. Similarly here, the usufruct or the benefit or the utility which would be sold has to be specified as well. Now, if you look at this definition given by Ayofi in Sharia standard number 9, it says Ijara is a leasing of property pursuant to a contract under which a specified permissible benefit in the form of a usufruct is obtained for a specific period in return for a specified permissible consideration. So there are several things in this definition. Here it's a property leased, and then there would be a contract. The benefit would be permissible, and then it would be obtained for a specific period, because when I'm selling the utility, it has to be specified, and of course in the specification, the most popular is the period. All right, and then for a specified permissible consideration, meaning that the consideration or the price that would be paid would also be permissible, or it could be also interpreted as that the utility which it would be used for would also be permissible. We will go into the details, inshallah. Another definition could be that Ijara refers to an Islamic leasing contract of land, property, or equipment that is rented to a lessee. Lessee is the person. Lessee is the one who is taking the lease for a stream of rental payments. So there would be a rental payments, either a one-time rental or a periodic rentals or frequent rentals. Anyway, so there are basically several types of ijara. Most prominently, two types. One is asset ijara, ijaratul a'yan. So asset ijara is whereby an asset is rented out. An asset is given as an ijara. For example, I gave the example of the car. So if I am renting out, I am renting the car. So I'm basically renting an asset. So it's an ijaratul a'yan. Another form of ijara is services ijara, ijaratul khidmat, or basically how it works is that, for example, a person, I mean, all of us or most of us, we are employed with some company or some entity. We provide a service and we get a salary or fee or consultancy, whatever. So all of those consultancy agreements, employment agreements, right, service agreements are all actually in Sharia ijara contracts. Why? Because the contract, the sold item here is basically a usufruct, a usufruct of the person. Let's say I'm employed under certain company. So what I'm actually doing with the company is basically I'm selling my intellect, my time, my usufruct, my own labor. So and then in exchange of that, I'm getting certain salary or certain fees, right? So that's also an ijara, but this ijara is called ijaratul khidmat because I'm not renting an asset itself. It's a human being, but the human being is not an asset. It could be sold. Rather, the utility or the labor of the human being is sold. So to make it easy, it's basically a hiring of labor or under any contract related to work against a return. So there would be a return, of course. If there is no return, then it's not ijara contract. So again, ijara is similar to bay' or sale in the sense that both are basically a sale contract. However, we call bay' or sale of ownership of asset as a sale contract, whereby a sale of usufruct is not called usually bay', rather it's called ijara. Okay, so let's go through a very basic process flow of ijara, how it works. I tried to make it very simple. So you can see in the very first place, there is an agreement between the lessor and the lessee. So the lessor is basically the person who is leasing out his asset, and the lessee is the one who is taking the lease. In Islamic terms, or in terms mentioned in the fiqh books, the lessor is called ajir, the one who is giving the ijara, and the lessee is mustajir, the one who is taking the lease or taking the ijara. And then we have ijara asset or ma'jur. Ma'jur is the asset whose utility is given as an ijara. So we see in the very first place, of course, there has to be an offer and acceptance, just like any other sale contract or any other contract that we have mentioned throughout the last 3 weeks as well. And then secondly, the lessor would deliver the asset to the lessee, and then lessee would start paying the rental. So this is a very basic flow. The lessor gives the asset, and the lessee starts paying the rental. Now, if we go a bit more complicated version of it, which is what happens in our banks or financial institutions. So what happens is basically the lessee or the one or the customer, let's call it him the customer. The customer comes to the bank and he says, okay, I want to lease a car from you. And maybe he is also defining the car, or maybe specifying the car or even the vendor. Then bank basically procures that asset from the vendor, right? So let's say this is a car showroom or a car dealer, and the bank is purchasing that car from the vendor, and a bank has an agreement with the vendor directly, and then a bank makes the payment to the vendor, and the vendor delivers the asset to the bank. Once bank gets the asset delivered, then bank would have another contract, another Ijara contract. So this contract is not Ijara. This is a normal bay contract or sale contract, because bank is purchasing the asset. Now, after the ownership has been transferred, the possession of the asset has been transferred. Now it will sign a Ijara contract with the lessee. The lessee here again is the customer of the bank. Now, after signing the contract, bank will deliver the asset to the customer or to the lessee, and then lessee or the customer will pay periodic rental amounts to the bank. Now, this is very basic, but it could be customized a bit. For example, what happens in practice for many banks is that the bank would basically appoint the lessee himself to be the agent of the bank. We discussed similar thing in Murabaha as well, if you recall, because in Murabaha also it happens the same. Bank is supposed to procure the asset directly from the vendor, but in many cases in practice, they appoint the customer or the client as an agent for them to procure the asset from the vendor. Now, once he procures the asset from the vendor on behalf of the bank, then he has to transfer the ownership of the asset to the bank or to the financial institution, and then only he can, sign the agreement or get possession of. This is for sales contract or murabaha contract. For ijara, we will go into the next slides. There is an option then that a lessor and a lessee can sign a forward lease, an ijara mawsufa fi zimma. So in other words, they may sign a lease agreement even before they get the asset, if the asset is not identified rather is specified. So mawsufa fi zimma or future ijara is basically when the asset is specified by specifications. It is not specified in the sense that it is identified, because when the asset is identified and it is not procured, then it is not valid, right? So it has to be specified by specifications, and only when it is delivered to the customer, then only they can get the rental. We will see in the next few slides as well, inshallah. Now, a bit of variation from this same structure that you are seeing in the screen is diminishing musharraka, or a musharraka, sorry, diminishing musharraka, or we can call it like ijara muntahiya bit tamlik, a bit more same, but let's call it ijara muntahiya bit tamlik. So what happens is that in ijara muntahiya bit tamlik, the person who is the lessor and the lessee and the lessor, in this case the bank, they both purchase the asset as a joint ownership. So in the last episode, we discussed about musharaka. So one of the variation of musharaka which are being used today is diminishing musharaka or musharaka muntahiya bit tamlik. Now the same, a bit of same structure is also done through ijara. How it works is that in this same one, let's say the customer needs to buy the ijara asset. So what he will do is he will go to the bank, and the bank, so the ultimate goal for the customer is to get ownership of the asset, not to just have an operating lease. So we know financial lease and operating lease, right? So operating lease is where I really want to just lease the asset. I don't have an end goal to purchase the asset or get a full ownership of the asset. Whereby financial lease is where the lease is just a vehicle to finance the asset for the lessee. So in this case, let's say the lessee wants to ultimately purchase the asset. So what will happen is that the same structure, the lessee will go to the bank and all those things will happen. However, one thing will happen here is basically after the entire ijara rental payment, there will be a separate contract. There will be a separate contract which will basically say that the lessor, the bank, has sold the asset to the lessee. So there will be a separate buy contract, right? It will not be conditional in the same ijara contract. It will be a separate contract and only executed after the in the very last phase of the entire Ijara rental payments. Other than that, the rest of the thing are quite similar. So in the next few slides, we will be discussing few more conditions about those Ijara contracts, which will be more or less applicable in other variants of the Ijara contract as well. Okay, so those are the basic types of Ijara. We have Ijara Tajriliya, which is operating lease, as I just mentioned. Ijara Muntahiya with Tamlik, which is basically financial lease. Muntahiya with Tamlik which is ended with ownership transfer. Tamlik means transfer of ownership. Muntahiya means ended. So it ends with a transfer of ownership. So even though it's a rental contract, it's a lease contract, but the end goal is to have an ownership of the asset. And then Ijara Mawsufa fi Dhimma is a future lease, which I already mentioned, which I will also discuss a bit more in the next few slides, inshallah. Okay, so this slide contains a bit of differences between a conventional financial lease and Ijara Muntahiya bit Tamlik, which is an Islamic lease. Now, in a conventional financial lease, the leased asset is not owned by the bank in most cases. However, in a Ijara Muntahiya bit Tamlik, as just like any other Ijara contract, it has to be leased, it has to be owned by the bank. If the ownership is not with the bank cannot take the rental of the asset. So this is a very basic rule in Ijara. Then, because the ownership belongs to the bank must bear the risk of loss of the asset. So what happens in an Ijara contract is when a lease agreement is signed, the lessee or the person who is basically taking the lease, he will be like a trustee to the lessor. Meaning that what does it mean? An amin or trustee is like they have to the person has to act based on the best interest of the owner. In other words, let's say I take a lease of a car. Okay, I take a car by rent. I have to take care of it for the best interest of it. It's not like, okay, I took these as a lease and I can just do anything with it. No, I am given this amana to take care of this asset. Right now, if after taking proper care it gets damaged, then I am not responsible for it, just like an amana. However, if there is a gross negligence on my part as a trustee or as an amin, then I have to bear the loss that is incurred due to this negligence. So for example, I take a car for rent, right? So I am supposed to lock it. I'm supposed to maybe park it in a proper manner and all those things. But what if I leave it out without proper protection, without locking it, and just it gets some thief comes in and takes it away, or any other thing happens to it because of not taking proper care of it. So end of the day, I would be held responsible for it, and I would be held, liable for the loss. But if it is not the case, in any other case, let's say the lessee has taken all proper protection of it, but suddenly a fire broke down, or something happened not really tied to the negligence of the lessee. So in that case, the lessor or the owner of the asset has to bear that risk. So we have to bear in mind that the owner of the asset is getting the rental because of his ownership. It's because of the risk of ownership that he is taking. So if we remove that risk, it makes the contract void. So the fundamental risk which are associated to an ownership has to be there. It cannot be passed. This risk cannot be passed. We will go deeper into it in the next few slides as well, inshallah. So this is a difference. In an Ijara Muntahiya bit Tamlik, even though we call it a financial lease, but in this case, the risk of the loss of the asset is not passed to the customer, rather the bank bears the risk. Thirdly, no rent prior to the delivery of the asset can be taken. So in a conventional financial lease, we see this happens. But in Islamic lease, in a Ijara Muntahiya bit Tamlik, because the lease is basically a price for the usufruct. Again, if you recall, I remember I started the session with that Ijara is a sale contract. Ijara is a sale contract, but sale of what? sale of usufruct, sale of benefit or utility of the asset. And what do you get in exchange? You get price, which we call ujra, which we could call fees, which we call rental amount or whatever. So there has to be the exchange item, which is the product. In a sale contract, we call it a product. In this case, the asset which is whose usufruct has been leased out. So if, for example, someone has rented out a car, right? Let's say he rented for 10 hours or one day or whatever time, and he rented out from 6 a.m. until 6 p.m. What if he didn't get the car delivered to him until 5 p.m.? Will Sharia still impose him that he has to pay the full rent? No, because he didn't get the delivery of the asset. He didn't has the option to enjoy the usufruct of the asset. See, it has to be made available. It is not necessary that he needs to use it. Both are two different things. So let's say in this same example, if the car has been delivered prior to 6 a.m., however, he didn't use it for whatever reason. Maybe he suddenly changed his plan, or maybe whatever happened, he didn't use it, but the car was still with him for the entire period that he has lease period. So then he has to pay the rent because the usufruct was available for him to enjoy, for him to use. Even though he didn't use, still Sharia will regard this as it has been utilized. But if the asset is not delivered, then he cannot pay rent, or even if he pay rent, it will not be halal for the lessor, for the one who is giving the ijara. Similarly, any early termination. So any lease contract, we know that it will be specified by the asset, specified by the distance, by the duration. So based on the different variants of the asset, underlying asset. So one of the form of a specification is a specification through the time period, right? Let's say for the lease for 1 month, or lease for 1 year or something. Now, prior to that time period, end of the time period, if they want to terminate, they have to terminate with mutual consent. This is applicable for all contracts in Sharia, because a contract, once an offer and acceptance has been there, it is binding on both parties. The terms cannot be changed unilaterally. The contract cannot be ended unilaterally. Both parties need to agree and change the terms. Both parties need to agree and then end the contract. So that is very basic principle for any contract in Sharia. Now, lastly, about late payments. So in Islamic lease, late payment can be charged. Why? As a deterrent for, let's say, for avoiding late payments. But this is not halal for the bank, because any late payment on due, any penalty on the dues is just riba, straightforwardly riba. Now, what can we do? We will say, find alternative ways so that you don't have to charge penalties. So, for example, if I go deeper into this, what is the objective of imposing late payment penalties? The objective is to get the payment, right? To settle the payment from the lessee. So if that's the objective, then we need to see, is a late payment penalty is something effective? Like, is it contributing to lessening or decreasing the amount of late payments? We see it's in most cases it's not. But even though there is a penalty, still people are defaulting. So meaning that this is not the most effective way to impose people or enforce people to pay on time. So there has to be other ways as well. So this is where we see that scholars have suggested many ways. For example, I can recall Sheikh Mufti Usmani Hafizahullah. He has suggested that why not we have a consolidated blacklist among the defaulters. So if someone is defaulting because he's really in some going through some circumstances, then based on Al-Quran, we should give him some time, فَنَظِرَةٌ إِلَى مَيْسَرَةٍ, as mentioned in Al-Quran. However, if that's not the case, if the person is defaulting without any Sharia valid reason, then it's just a matalul ghani zulmun. It is mentioned as zulm. It's an oppression. A person who is able to pay back but is still not paying back, he is basically doing a zulm, an oppression. And there is another hadith where Prophet ﷺ mentioned az-zulmu zulumatun yawm al-qiyamah. Those small zulm or individual zulm will form like a big zulm, a lot of zulm and lot of darkness during the day of judgment. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala save us from those. So in other words, we have to be innovative. This is something has been there for decades, but it doesn't really mean that this is the most effective method. Now today we have blockchain, we have many other ways, consolidated ways, whereby we can create deterrence for the defaulters. So a person or an entity who is defaulting with one financial institution should be stopped from getting any financing or loans from any other financial institution. They have to agree on that. Anyway, so even then, even there, though, let's say someone is saying, sorry, we are doing all those things, but still we cannot stop defaults. And we see that only way is to charge late penalty. So the scholars would say, okay, if that's the case, you charge it, but it has to be given to charity. It's not halal for the bank to consume the income. It's not halal for the shareholders, for the depositors to enjoy the return, because it is riba. So it has to be channeled to a charity. So this is where there is a charity clause mentioned in the Ijara contract for late payment penalties. Okay, now let's go through a few other conditions of Ijara. Number one, we have to remember that this is a transfer of usufruct. It's not a transfer of ownership. So this first thing, I think we already understand that. Now the usufruct must be permissible by Sharia. What it means is that, how can we measure or we determine if the usufruct is permissible? So two ways. Firstly, the asset itself has to be permissible. Let's say a usufruct of what? A car. Okay, a car is halal, fine. Then Sharia wise it's permissible. So we will consider the usufruct is permissible. I mean, one of the conditions of being permissible is met. And then if you look at the third one, which is a third bullet point here, this is the other part of being permissible, making the usufruct permissible. This is what it says is that the usage or the use case of the usufruct needs to be permissible as well. So for example, a lease of car, the car itself is a halal, is a Sharia permissible product. So the usufruct of it is permissible, no issue. But let's say the car is being used for some Sharia non-permissible thing, or let's say forget about car. Let's take a house rent, for example. So any house by default, it's permissible. So the usufruct supposedly also permissible. However, we need to see what is the house used for. Is it used for a conventional bank, for example, a conventional financial institution, a wine factory, or something else which are deemed impermissible in Sharia? If that's the case, then we will say the usufruct is not permissible. So the usufruct needs to be permissible by Sharia. Secondly, it has to be valuable. In a same contract, we had the same condition as well. Any commodity which is sold, it has to be mal mutaqawwim. Mal mutaqawwim means it is valid by Sharia. It is also considered a valuable item. Now, is something valuable or not? It is subjective. It is left to the judgment of the custom. Sharia will not come in and say, okay, this is valuable, this is not valuable. No issue. Anything that is considered valuable among the parties would be considered valuable. But if something is not considered valuable, still that is made commodity of the or subject matter of the contract, then basically in most cases it is usually a leeway to riba. For example, I need loan of $100,000, and the one who is lender, he needs basically 10% interest. But we know that interest is riba. So what we are saying, okay, we are walking through the road and we are saying we are looking at some grass in a park, and we say, okay, this grass that you see in the park is basically the commodity or the product or the subject matter of a contract. So I'm selling you this at $110,000, and you're purchasing from me this at $100,000. So what I'm trying to say is that if the product of the subject matter is not considered valuable, something of value to the parties, then usually this could be a leeway to fictitious contracts, like non-genuine contracts, which is what Sharia is concerned about. Sharia is concerned about to fix all the loopholes that could be existent in terms of in financial contracts. So anyway, it has to be valuable, it has to be specified. Now, a specification could be by features, like let's say if I want to rent a car, then the car could be specified by the model, the make, and etc. And then it could be further identified. So it could say that, okay, this car is what you are renting out or I'm renting out. And further, it could be also quantified. The end goal objective of this bullet point is that whatever is the subject matter of a contract, in this case, the usufruct, has to be specified so that there is no ambiguity, no reason of dispute between the parties. Then asset should not be consumable or perishable. For example, it cannot be like, okay, a bread. I'm renting out bread. Cannot, because in a rent contract, in a Ijara contract, the underlying asset, which is basically the source of usufruct, needs to be in its original form, and it shouldn't be altering because of the usage. For example, we can take real assets like land, vehicles, machines. But what happens in for consumables or let's say perishable ones, because people can, I mean, if someone wants to use it, someone wants to usufruct it, it will alter from its original form. So that's not a valid item for Ijara. That's valid for sale contract, but not for Ijara. Okay, now some considerations about rentals. A person can, a lessor can only charge rental when the asset is in possession of the lessee and is usable. So this is very important point. I think I also elaborated a bit in the previous, when I was discussing in the previous slide. So basically the asset that is being leased out, it has to be possessed by the lessee. It has to be usable. So let's say we have a contract, a very popular contract called Diminishing Musharraka. Musharraka Muntahiya bit Tamlik. Usually this contract is used for house financing, a kind of alternative for mortgage financing. In some countries, it's also called HPSM, or hire purchase under Shirkatul Milk. So what happens is, in the first phase, the bank or the financial institution and the customer both comes together to form a joint ownership on the asset, over the asset. So for example, the bank will pay 90% or 80%, and the customer would pay 10% or 20%. And then they jointly will purchase the house. And then in the next 15, 20 years or whatever amount of a period of years, the client or the client will basically pay a portion of the price of the asset, and also pay a portion of the rental. So rental for what? Rental for using the portion which is owned by the bank. So the bank owns 80%, customer owns 20%. So customer would basically every month pay an installment, and the installment would be a combination of a portion of increasing the capital, meaning that ultimately the customer wants to get 100% ownership. So his installment would also include a purchase price, portion of the purchase price, and also a portion of the rental, because he's using the 80%, he's using the portion of asset which is also owned by the bank. Now, if the house is not ready to be used, okay, let's say the asset was what is the asset? The asset, the property is basically an apartment, and the apartment is not yet fully completed. The walls are still yet to be ready. Maybe the apartment is 20th floor, but the building is just completed until 10th floor. So whatever the reason, the asset is not ready yet. It's not usable yet. If it is not ready and usable, the bank cannot charge rent for that period of time. So agreement can be done, no problem. As we also mentioned that there is a form of Ijara called Ijara Mawsufa fi Dhimma, which is basically a forward lease. So I can have a rental agreement signed today that it will be effective from, let's say, May 2021 or 3 months later. That is fine. But I cannot charge rental before the asset is delivered to the lessee and it is usable. Usable in the sense that its primary benefit is usable. So for example, a house, why is a house is beneficial? Because it protects us from the maybe rain, sunlight. It makes us secure, right? So if those fundamental usufructs are not ready, there is no door, or there is no roof, for example, or the wall is not ready, then we will consider the house is not usable. Similarly, a car is why do someone rent why would someone rent a car? So that he can transport from one place to another. So what if the engine is not ready, or the engine is broken and he is unable to use the car? So in those cases, when the asset is not usable, the lessor cannot charge any rental. So this is very, very important and distinguishing factor for the Ijara contract. Secondly, the maintenance cost. Who would bear the maintenance cost? Now, when the lessee is leasing the asset, renting the asset, he is responsible, as I mentioned in the very beginning, that a lessee is basically an amin, a trustee for the asset, to take care of the asset. So from that point of view, he is responsible to take the basic, care of the asset. For example, if it's a car, then he has to change the fuel, engine oils, maybe the other periodic maintenance that he is required to do. However, if there is a major impairment or a major repair is required, that is something that has to be borne by the lessor, because the lessor needs to ensure that the asset is usable, asset remains usable, and the lessee has to ensure that the asset is at his best, I mean, taken at best care. So, for example, if the asset is put under circumstances because of his negligence, and then it is damaged, then he has to bear the cost. But if there is no such negligence found and he's just using as usual, he's taking care of the basic day-to-day maintenance and care of it, still there is a major impairment there, and major repair required, that cost, that expense would be borne by the lessor. So the ownership risk of the asset still belongs to the lessor. The lessor cannot, transfer all the risk of ownership to the lessee. He cannot transfer the taxation, for example, or even certain insurance and other things. Maybe yes, he can agree there with the lessee that okay, lessee would pay on behalf of him. However, lessee would be given the chance to settle it against the rental payments payable to the lessor, because those are related to the ownership of the asset itself. Okay, now in terms of fixing the rentals can be fixed as a flat rental across the period. For example, if the rent is for 5 years, now the entire 5 years could be one rental amount, no issue, or it can be variable. Now variable, for example, let's say in year one it is $1,000, in year two $1,200, in year four, year three another $200 extra, like that, it is fine as well. Or even it could be tied to a known benchmark or formula which is agreed upon by both parties. Now the end objective here is to remove ambiguity as much as we can so that it doesn't lead to dispute between the parties. That's the end objective. So if that objective could be met by linking to a benchmark, still it's fine. Still is fine, as long as it doesn't lead to an ambiguity or dispute between the parties. That would be an issue. Okay, so now I think this is the last slide today. Some common issues in Ijara contracts. So we see lease of perishable or consumable items. So that's not allowed. I think it's already understood. Uh, we cannot charge rent before delivery of the asset and before it is usable. This is a very, very common issue. So I think we addressed it quite extensively. Without ownership of the asset, as I mentioned, that a forward lease can be agreed upon, signed upon, but to get the right of receiving the rent, one has to have the ownership of the asset. If the bank or the financial institution doesn't have the ownership, how can he have the right to own the rental amount? So that's why he needs to have the ownership of the asset first. Now, if the asset is still non-existing, again, just like in the very first bullet point, if the asset is not existing, then rent cannot be charged because it is not delivered, because it is not owned, because it is not possessed, because it is not usable by the lessee. Waiving ownership related responsibilities. So let's say the lessor says, I am not responsible for anything of this asset. He puts a clause and both parties agree. This will make the Ijara contract void, because when I am discharging myself from complete risk of the ownership, then the ownership is basically has to be transferred. However, because the contract is an Ijara contract, the ownership is not transferred as well. So where it stays, the contract cannot be in between. So it will be void. It will be void and it has to be a new contract again with proper principles and clauses. Ownership related expenses to be borne by the lessor, already we discussed. Sale contract or undertaking to sell must be separate. Okay, this is for Ijara Muntahiya bit Tamlik or diminishing Ijara or diminishing Musharraka, such contracts whereby either there is, usually there is a sale contract at the very end, and also there is an undertaking to sell or purchase by either the lessor or the lessee. Now, any such additional thing, any such additional contract we want to put in, it has to be always separate. Okay, so a sale contract, for example, it will come at certain period of time. Of course, it has to be separate and it will only be executed at that period of time. It shouldn't be executed and signed upon as one set of paper in the very beginning, cannot. Similarly, if there is an undertaking to sell, let's say the lessor is signing an undertaking that I will sell. I'm undertaking that I will sell this property at this and this period of time. This is fine, but it has to be unconditional to the Ijara contract. This is true for any two sets of contract, any combination of two sets of contract. I think we discussed this during Murabaha as well, because in case of Murabaha also, usually the customer, when he approaches the bank, there is an undertaking or there is a promise. Anyway, that's a bit different. Sorry, that's a bit different. I think it comes in diminishing musharraka. Sorry, in diminishing musharraka, we didn't discuss diminishing musharraka in detail in the last episode. Inshallah, maybe in the next season we will have separate episode on diminishing musharraka. So in diminishing musharraka also there is similarly an undertaking to either purchase or sell. So in any case, in anywhere, wherever there are more than one contracts coming into the picture, we have to note that all of those contracts, number one, has to be separate. It cannot be conditional. Separate, it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to have two separate set of documents, let's say printed in two sets. No, it doesn't necessarily mean that. It can be under one file as well, but it has to be two separate agreements. It cannot be conditional in one. For example, in last episode we had what if a musharraka partner is also demanding a salary, fixed salary. Let's say the musharraka partner is a director and we want to pay him salary. Then there will be a separate Ijara contract, service Ijara, service lease agreement, which will be completely separate from the musharraka agreement. No relation whatsoever between the two agreements. So this is number one condition whenever there are more than one contracts. Second condition is that each contract, since it is separate, has to individually fulfill the requirements of Sharia for that particular contract. So let's see, if we say it's a sale and purchase, sale and purchase and Ijara. So there are two contracts. Then Ijara has to fulfill all the conditions of Ijara. Sale contract has to fulfill all the conditions of sale. If we say that it's Musharraka and Ijara, the Musharraka has to fulfill all the conditions of Musharraka, and then Ijara has to fulfill all the Sharia conditions of Ijara. So whenever there are more contracts, we have to remember that in Islamic law of contract, there is no room for fictitious contract. It has to be all genuine and follow the conditions that are imposed by Sharia and Islamic jurisprudence. Okay, so I think with that, we come to the end of this episode, not only this episode, but also this season. Alhamdulillah, we tried to cover the very basics, and inshallah, if Allah gives us tawfiq, we continue the next seasons. We will see that all of the other contracts that we discuss follow based on the very basic principles that we have discussed throughout this season. So if you have followed through, if you have taken notes, I really hope that in most cases you will find it very much comfortable and to you, inshallah, whatever contract you come across in Islamic finance. Okay, so now inshallah I will take the Q&As. I think there are a few Q&As in the Q&A section. Why is penalty considered riba in Sharia? Okay, thank you for the question, Manal. We covered this in the very first episode. So riba is basically a pre-agreed upon increase in amount in exchange of a loan contract or a payable. So when it comes to an Ijara rental payment, the payment is basically a payable. It is determined. It is in exchange of the usufruct. Now, if you want to charge anything again, on top of it because of the delay, because of the time, then it will be considered riba. This is basically based on very classic definition of riba. It's not something new. It was very well known. Payable because of Ijara, payable because of a sale contract, whatever. If the payment is late and we impose some penalty on it, on top of it, it's basically considered riba. So that's the reason. Okay, in late charge or penalty, there are two terms used, ta'zir and ta'wiz. What is the difference between those two things? It's a very good question. I don't think I can give very detail on those two today. Ta'wiz is basically a compensation, and ta'zir is basically a penalty. Now, ta'wiz compensation, usually we mean is that, okay, if there is a loss incurred because of someone, then the person needs to compensate. And usually it is considered that ta'wiz is fine, ta'zir is not fine, meaning that a penalty is not fine, but ta'wiz would be fine, because compensation or ta'wiz is basically, it's a compensation of darar, it's a compensation of a loss that has been caused by the person who caused it. For example, if someone is late in payment, so he is causing a loss to the other party, and he is basically compensating for that loss. This is usually, I mean, in very layman term, this is ta'wiz. However, there are few things we have to consider. Firstly, in Sharia, there is no room for potential loss, okay, or opportunity loss. So, for example, if someone is paying late, we would say, okay, I have lost this and this amount. Why? Because if you would have paid in due time, I would have been able to invest that amount in this and this, and I would have the opportunity to earn this and this. So these are not basically considered as proper loss in the eyes of Sharia. Sharia only considers actual loss. So if there is an actual loss, then that's something maybe would be considered by Sharia. This is the very first principle. Secondly, in cases where it is already declared or I mean very well known as riba, in those cases the concept of ta'wiz or ta'zir are quite problematic or quite sensitive, I would say. I know that with respect to a lot of scholars, they have done their ijtihad and it is well practiced in many countries. No reason to point out to them. Everyone has done their ijtihad, and inshallah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give all the mustahids rewards according to them. But according to IOFI, we try to follow IOFI in our episodes. According to IOFI, a ta'wiz in this case for late penalty would be deemed riba, and it has to be channeled to charity. Inshallah, if Allah wills, Allah gives tawfiq, we will try to have detailed session in one of our next seasons. Thank you so much. Okay, I have another question. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. Can I clarify in a certain matter? If a person could not afford a Sharia compliant investment, policy due to higher cost or premium? Can he, for a start, invest in a cheaper but non-Sharia compliant plan and dispose of the interest when he receives the payout? Okay, now, wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. First, let's see the gravity of this issue. It's not just like, okay, I choose this and I will dispose the interest at a later period of time. It's not like that. Dear brothers and sisters, in the very first episode, we detailed on riba. See, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has clearly mentioned, فَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلُوا فَأَذَنُوا بِحَرْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. If you don't leave up interest or riba, then be ready to wage war against Allah and His Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we mentioned in detail that this is something so heavy, so heavy. We always make dua, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from this. But it is something that hasn't been mentioned for any other sinful act in Al-Quran Kareem. It's such a worst thing. And on top of this, Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam also mentioned, it was also mentioned that la'ana Rasulullah sallam akila riba wa mukilahu wa shahidahi wa katibahu, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has cursed the people behind riba. For example, the ones who takes it, the ones who gives it, the ones who witness it, and also the ones who write the contracts. So in light with the above, the riba contract itself is problematic, itself is cursed, even though we don't take the riba. Now, when there is no option available, when, for example, countries where we don't have any option available and we are bound to, use ribawi bank accounts. So in such cases, the scholars of those countries usually they permit, okay, you use it based on the concept of zarura, on the concept of necessity, but you use until what is really necessity. For example, you really need a credit card and there is no other option available. Okay, you use it, but give up the interest or pay before an interest is incurred. But the case you have mentioned, it clearly shows that there is an option. It's just that the option is a bit pricey. Now, I personally don't think this is a reason for us to indulge in riba. If we continue to do so, there will be no riba-free products. We have to use more and more, even though those are pricey. And inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward us that we are using, even though those are pricey, those are expensive. And inshallah, because of us using those products, more and more people will use it, demand will be created, supply will be more, and the price will go lower up to the par of other conventional products as well. Inshallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy. He mentioned in Al-Quran, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. Whoever strives to be on my path, meaning Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's path, Allah opens for him a lot of ways, numerous ways. So inshallah, Allah will help you and of all of us. Okay, the next question, how does lessor make income or profit? Please use example, car dealer, bank, customer. Second question, is there transfer of ownership at the end of the contract? Okay, thank you. Two questions, how does the lessor or the bank make profit? Now, the lessor here is the bank, right? In our, as you mentioned, the example we should use is the bank, car dealer, and customer. So let's see what is the flow again. The flow was that the customer would procure, let me share my screen again so that we can visualize it, okay? Yeah, I think this one, right? So if you recall, the lessor here is the bank. So the bank will purchase the asset from the vendor. So let's say the bank purchases the asset from the vendor at 30,000 US dollars, right? The car from 30,000 US dollars. Now the bank will basically rent out to the lessee at a price, of course, at which it will make profit. Now, in case of bank, usually it's not operating lease. Usually it's financial lease. In case of financial lease, the end objective is to make the lessee the ultimate owner. So bank will basically compute installments and a period of contract based on which it can make the profit. So if it wants to make a profit of 10%, for example, then it's $3,000. So it will try to make like $33,000, including the all the installments and the period of contract. It's 3 years, 5 years, or whatever. And at the end of the contract, maybe just before the last installment, there will be a sale contract with only the last installment as mentioned as the price. So basically, the price is also incorporated in the periodic rental payments. This is how it will work. Hope that answers your question. Okay, I think we have few more questions in chat box. If the customer forget to renew the car insurance and the car is stolen, who is responsible? Okay, if the customer forgot to renew the car insurance and the car is stolen, who is responsible? It's a very good question. Basically, insurance, in principle, is a responsibility of the lessor. But in case of car, usually the one who is the ultimate beneficiary, usually he needs to make the insurance, right? However, if the car is stolen, maybe it will of course depend on the contract that is between the two parties. But in normal sense, if the asset of the Ijara is stolen, and the lessee as an amin or as a trustee has already taken proper care of it, he didn't have any negligence, then usually it has to be under the risk of the lessor, meaning the lessor, who is the original owner of the asset, has to bear it. Yeah, thank you. And I think, can we make prepayment in Ijara? Yeah, why cannot? Prepayment meaning that, let's say an Ijara has been concluded for, let's say, 1 year, and someone wants to pay 6 months in advance, it's fine. Just like we, in case of house rent, usually prepayment is usually done. For example, maybe in the fifth day of the month or seventh day of the month, the person has to pay the rent. Usually that's what we see in most customary practices. So prepayment is fine. No issue on that. One thing is that if the scholars have mentioned this in fiqh books, that if the Ijara doesn't have a certain period, let's say if the Ijara doesn't say, the contract doesn't say that it is for 1 year, for example, and it is, let's say, for monthly, let's say, and then the lessee has paid, let's say, 6 months of payment in advance, then the Ijara will be considered a minimum duration of 6 months, meaning that within that 6 months, he cannot say, okay, I actually didn't have a contract for 6 months and I want to get my refunds. No, it cannot be, unless with mutual consent of the lessor. That's the only thing I think was mentioned. Okay, I think we have one more question in the Q&A. Two more questions. Please, how can we get the slides and the recording of the previous session? I think if you have registered, the recording will be sent to you. Most probably already sent previously. If not, then inshallah you will be receiving very soon. How will you treat time value of money in Islamic finance economy? Time value of money, it's a long discussion, but in general, time value of money is not completely ignored. It is considered if it is a part and parcel of a exchange contract. For example, time value of money is basically a feature of the price or the service fee. Let me give you an example. So if I want to sell some car in a spot price, I would sell at $10,000. But if I want to sell with an option, not option, basically with a flexibility to pay in 2 years, 3 years, I can consider that feature as a variable to determine the price. That value of time, which comes as an underlying variable to determine the price, is permissible in Islamic finance. But time doesn't have a separate value. For example, if someone is making a default, is delaying the payment, for example, as we discussed today, in that case, time becomes a separate factor. So in the cases where time is a separate factor, it cannot be valued by money, meaning that it cannot earn money. Time itself cannot earn money. But when time is part and parcel of a pricing, of a product pricing, then it's fine. So we can discuss this in detail, inshallah, if when we discuss, for example, installment sales. If someone sells a product at installment, he can have a higher price compared to the spot price. But the condition, there is a condition. The condition is the price cannot be variable. The price cannot say, okay, if you pay in spot, this is the price. If you pay in 3 months, this is the price. If you pay in 6 months, this is the price. The contract cannot be concluded with the price keeping variable. The price has to be determined. Let's say if it's 6 months, it has to be determined based on the price of the 6 months. Then after that, if the customer is paying early, still he has to contractually pay the full amount. If he is paying late, still he has to contractually pay the amount that is agreed upon. So this is where the time becomes a feature or a variable or determinant of the price itself. But when we talk about time value of money from the conventional sense, in that case, usually time itself has a value, which we don't see considered in the Islamic economic and finance. Okay, in the peer-to-peer, I think we have to finish very soon, inshallah. Let's take the last few, I think two more questions only. Is the peer-to-peer company, in the peer-to-peer company, how to separate qard and wakala bil ujra, how to avoid the riba? Okay, it's a very, it demands detailed answer. I'm afraid I think we are in shortage of time, but just to give the answer quickly, qard and wakala bil ujra is actually qard is a loan, a benevolent loan, right? We know that qard or loan should be without any benefit. Now, when qard is attached or linked in whatever way with another exchange contract, another contract that brings benefit, this is basically a bit problematic from Sharia point of view. Even though scholars have, many scholars, even contemporary scholars have also permitted, okay, on one hand there is qard, on one hand there is wakala bil ujra, and you don't earn from the qard, but you earn from the ujra. But still, there are issues we have to be careful about. I think we don't have time today to detail that. Inshallah, in the next season, we will have a separate episode on qard, and we will further detail on what can and what we cannot do with qard. Okay, is there any halal credit card system? Yes, there are several halal credit card has been developed by the industry. And for example, based on murabaha, based on tawarruq, based on qard and ujra, just like someone asked this question for peer-to-peer just now, as I answered, there is such model for credit card as well. But in general, just to be very brief, Sharia has not encouraged us to take loans without necessity. Loan is something, credit is something should be taken only for necessity. It's not for luxury. It's not for something that we really don't need. Sharia doesn't like that. There are many hadiths. Maybe in another season, another episode, we will detail about qard and loans, what Sharia, how Sharia perceives about it. Okay, and finally, I have a question regarding digital currency. What is the Sharia concerns on it? When it can be traded like a paper currency, and then when it can trade it like a paper currency, then why some of the Islamic countries not allowing it? Thank you, Sana. It demands a long answer, but to be very short, a digital currency would be a currency if it fulfills the features of currency. For example, for it to be a medium of exchange, of a store of value. So Sharia scholars, more or less, we see that the concern is basically, can we consider a digital currency as a currency or not? So this is a primary concern. And if you look at SSC of Sharia Advisory Council of Securities Commission of Malaysia, recently they have issued a resolution on that as well. And they basically considered all the digital currencies as urud, not basically like currencies, rather like other assets or other type of mal. So the concern basically is either it's a currency or not. This is number one. Secondly, either this fulfills the requirement of a valuable asset, of an asset that is permissible from Sharia point of view. These are basically the concerns. So once those becomes more popular, people start becoming exchanging those more like a currency. Of course, Sharia people, Sharia scholars would further look into it. Basically, Sharia scholars are not so much, about, I mean, they're not so much paying, would not pay heed about what the technology is or what it is called. Is it a currency or is it this and that? Rather, they would see what it is used for. So they would see the underlying use case of those currencies or tokens or asset, whatever we call it. And based on the use cases, they will give the Sharia pronouncements. So inshallah, I think this is something that we can have a separate session for it, so that we can further detail all the contemporary scholars' opinions and resolutions, and then we can further elaborate on it. Okay, I think with that, we have answered, alhamdulillah, all the questions we had. We thank all of you. I think there are few more questions. I'm sorry for that, but I'm sorry. I think we cannot address more questions today. We will try to respond to your questions by email, inshallah. All right. Thank you so much for attending the sessions. Today is the last session of this season, last episode of this season. If you are interested, please provide feedback so that we can consider continuing the next seasons, inshallah, with more in-depth sessions on specific contracts, specific issues. For example, sukuk, for example, this digital currency, as someone has asked, or any other relevant issues, inshallah. With that, I would like to finish this session today. Stay safe, stay strong. Have a very good Ramadan this year, inshallah. May Allah give us tawfiq to make this Ramadan the best Ramadan of our life. Ameen. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.